in this episode.
And so that gives us occasion to sort of say, what is that impulse to resolve the ambiguity and to settle the matter in such a way that the ambiguity becomes explained away? And I think he's worried about a tendency in the sciences and in much of the history of philosophy to seek those moments of resolution, to say, but what is it really? And he wants philosophers to sort of cultivate a feeling for ambiguity as ambiguity. And this becomes for him a sort of a wider, both methodological and then ontological thought. When he sees a number of sort of common oppositions, subject-object, free and determined, active-passive, and he finds instances where sort of one term of a binary is made more foundational, and finds ways in which you could sort of flip things around, right? Things that look passive can be seen as active from another perspective. And so for him, the methodological point there is to find where a phenomenon that seems determinable in one way could be determined in another, where the other way opposes the first. That's a methodological sort of feeling for ambiguity. But ultimately, I think he comes to the conclusion that that ambiguity has to be more fundamental than any of the resolutions that it gives rise to. And that becomes, I think, not just a methodological point, but an ontological one. The way that he thinks about nature and the physical world is as something that where form and content are ambiguous, where freedom and determinism are ambiguously intertwined.
Merleau-Ponty is one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. I've been studying Merleau-Ponty for years now, and whenever I approach his texts, I still feel I've barely scratched the surface. The more I learn about his work, the more I'm realizing he was one of those philosophical geniuses who virtually wrote on all topics, from politics and sociology to physics, psychology, and of course, the cognitive sciences, which is the topic of this episode. Robert and Jeff had a wonderful discussion on Merleau-Ponty's chiasmic logic of the flesh, his ontology of the body, and how ambiguity impregnates all of his philosophy. The conversation spanned from Nature of Phenomenology and Embodied cognitive science to Merleau-Pontian phenomenology's contrast to enactivism, ecological psychology, and the tradition of romanticism. I hope you enjoy this far-ranging dialogue as much as I did after this quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times that I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you another product or service that you probably don't need. That being said though, and forgive me for the tautology, we, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing research for my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall goodies. As far as I'm concerned, you're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's always going to be free is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters, and if you're considering supporting my work, please do so only if you have the means, especially in our precarious times. Alright, now to the episode. Yeah, as I was saying, welcome back, Jeff, and lovely to meet you, Robin. Thank you both for being here. I have been looking forward to this. And in fact, thanks, Jeff, for introducing me to Robin's work. I've really enjoyed the few papers I've read. Especially I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. The landscape of Merleau-Pontian thought was very useful. Although it warrants a couple of reads because it's a lot to take in at once. But on that note, at a high level, I thought I'd love for us to discuss, well, primarily you both to discuss kind of this relationship between Merleau-Ponty, this big philosopher, and then more of the contemporary cognitive sciences and the brain and mind sciences. That being said, though, I understand that you both have been having your own discussions, so it doesn't just have to be like here's Merleau-Ponty 101 introductory lecture. Maybe 30, 40 minutes into the conversation. Please get into whatever you want to get into. No barriers or no restrictions in that regard. But I would love to probably, just for more for the listener and even my sake, in fact, a bit of maybe a historical note, perhaps, probably starting off with you, Robin, just if you could explicate, Merleau-Ponty as a thinker and a philosopher, what's his background, and especially what was the philosophical milieu at the time that he was a part of in Europe. And then perhaps, and I'd love to hear this from both of you, on what was the influence of Merleau-Ponty on you both as philosophers?
Yeah. So I'll say a little bit about sort of, I guess, the world that Merleau-Ponty occupies, because he sort of turns up in conversation with a lot of other figures, because he was part of the sort of like very active and rich philosophical community in the mid 20th century in France. He really sort of came up as a student alongside people like Sartre and Beauvoir. He was friends as a student with Claude Lévi-Strauss. So a lot of the sort of big names of French philosophy in the 20th century were, friends and school friends and colleagues of Merleau-Ponty. So he studied philosophy with a real emphasis on the philosophy of science, or I should say, including an emphasis on philosophy of science with people like Léon Brunschvig in France, and sort of wrote his dissertation on a kind of Hegelian-inspired philosophy of science that became the structure of behavior. And then the Phenomenology of Perception is the text for which he is most well known. And he, I think, is distinct from a lot of the other figures of his time, like Sartre and Beauvoir. Yeah, there you go. The two big ones. Two of the three big ones. So he is sort of associated with Sartre and Beauvoir and the existentialist movement by a lot of people, although I think that's somewhat misleading, in part because it doesn't help to capture how scientifically informed and how scientifically engaged Merleau-Ponty was. So his first job at the Sorbonne was lecturing in child psychology, and he has sort of really interesting engagements with psychology, with psychoanalysis, with anthropology. After the Sorbonne, he went to University of Lyon. What was it? Yeah, Lyon, and lectured on physics, on biology. So he's really somebody who is constantly probing at the intersections between philosophy and the sciences, whether those are the human sciences, the natural sciences. So that's, I think, kind of how he finds a unique place in that historical milieu. Jeff, you want to add to that, or?
No, that was great. I could say a little bit about his initial influence on me, but I don't know if I should go first on that, or if you want to start.
Please. You could go ahead, Jeff, and then I'd love to hear from you too, Robin, because that's in fact really important for me, especially given you both are living, working philosophers. Why work on Merleau-Ponty?
Yeah, so first that was a great. I even started taking notes, Robin. That was very helpful.
It was Lyon, and then the Sorbonne, and then the École Normale. So
all right, I better fix that. Okay. But in terms of his initial influence on me, so I started off in phenomenology under Hubert Dreyfus at Berkeley. We've talked about this before, Rahul. And I got a kind of an exposure to all of the classical phenomenologists, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, de Beauvoir. And of those, Dreyfus, his favorites were Heidegger, and then to a lesser extent, Merleau-Ponty. And I have to say my initial reaction was not great. I remember I bought an earlier translation of Phenomenology of Perception. I really struggled with it. I could kind of understand what was going on when I would read Dreyfus, but I kept at it. I started teaching when I became a professor. I started teaching Intro to Phenomenology, and I taught a seminar where we went over being and nothingness and phenomenology of perception. And my initial impressions, to be honest, I felt like this is the canon. I ought to cover it. And it felt very like it felt with the German phenomenon with Husserl and Heidegger. It felt like there was a story there. It was in a very difficult language. It was very complicated, but there was a structure that I could piece together. I could learn to speak Husserlese or Heideggerese or maybe Dreideggerese, and it would kind of fit together into a system. But with Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, despite the differences which you allude to, which I agree with Robin, they both felt it felt French in a way, or it felt kind of journalistic, impressionistic. There were all these metaphors. There was like, you would find these really suggestive passages, and it wouldn't, but it wasn't cohering into something I could really sink my teeth into. And I have to be honest, the thing that this will just spell out, this will finish the story. It was, so I had this, we had this conference in 2018 that you were at, Robin. And then an anthology came out of that, The Landscape of Phenomenology, which was all these papers, the thing you read, Rahul, on like the state of the discipline. And so I read that paper pretty closely with you while you were writing it. And this concept of ambiguity in Merleau-Ponty, this idea that, well, it's not supposed to settle into a system. It's supposed to kind of challenge you and kind of push you around a little and destabilize you. That kind of unlocked the text for me. And it's been much more accessible to me since then, since I kind of stopped reading it the way I naturally read philosophers. And so, yeah, that's kind of the full trajectory. And I've just, a student from Turkey, Beza Kavus, and I have been working on Merleau-Ponty recently. And so it was kind of there through Dreyfus. And I had kind of had a weird relationship with it, but he's back for me. So thanks to you, Robin. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I mean, it's funny hearing you tell your story, Jeff, that maybe this is just a sort of personality difference between us, because everything that I think you found challenging is how I fell in love with Merleau-Ponty. I mean, this very like rich and evocative writing that I didn't quite know what to make of. And yet these images coming in and out of the text that just felt like they were capturing something, and I didn't know what they were capturing, but I could just feel that there was something there that I wanted to explore. That's, I think, what made me come back again and again to Merleau-Ponty. But there's a sort of like central idea in all of his thinking that I also have found very appealing. And it's this this sort of deep commitment to understanding a world on its own terms as being something that is complete. This comes through a lot in his lectures on child psychology, for instance. You know, he sort of is insistent that we not see the child as like a failed adult or somebody who has adult capacities only on the way to becoming the capacities they could be, but the child's world is complete, and the imagination is not, is the sort of like, you know, the metaphors that the child uses to talk about their world is getting at something real and true. And that's something that Merleau-Ponty does in whether he's writing about painting or whether he's writing about anthropology or animals or children or disability or just everyday perception. This deep commitment to understanding the phenomena and the world that those phenomena sort of comprise as full and rich and complete in its own way, to me has been an incredibly valuable not just way of thinking about Merleau-Ponty, but sort of like principle for how to think philosophically in general. So that's something that I really admire in his work, and that keeps me coming back to it.
Beautiful, lovely. Yeah. I mean, also, just reading his work, I mean, obviously, Gestalt psychology and all of that, the influence of just what you would call, I guess, the psychological sciences. I don't know if they would call it that, but you can clearly see that the guy spent a lot of time reading, to put it simply. Yeah. He took in a lot of these scientific texts. Well, one point I want to really, I guess, hone in on a bit is just, so, correct me if I'm wrong here, but like from all of this, the big figures in 20th century continental philosophy, I'd say probably after Heidegger, the only other name I can say here is Merleau-Ponty, who's been really fully absorbed into kind of the cognitive sciences and let's call it more of the scientific way of doing things when it comes to theorizing and thinking and whatnot. I mean, for sure, as you were saying, Jeff, one person I think we can thank, especially in the Anglophone world, is Hubert Dreyfus for doing this, for kind of Heidegger, kind of his way of bringing in the pragmatic Heidegger. And certainly some people are critical of him for doing that, but I mean, I see, especially kind of when I'm looking at the AI stuff and the cognitive science stuff, Heidegger's name mentioned everywhere. There were attempts to even do Heideggerian AI. And the other name for sure, no doubt, is Merleau-Ponty. So my question would be, again, to you both, what's so appealing about Merleau-Ponty's kind of theorizing in philosophy? Like, for instance, I don't know, I don't hear Hegelian AI or Hegelian cognitive science. I'm sure there is something being done there. But I read something on cognitive science or, artificial intelligence. Merleau-Ponty's name is mentioned somewhere. If it's more of like a, especially embodiment and all of that. But yeah, what is it about Merleau-Ponty that he's so appealing to the cognitive sciences? But also, really, a lot of his work has been absorbed now into kind of the embodied cognitive science or the 4E cognitive science approach.
I don't know, Jeff. Maybe you can say why he appeals to you and your work. And
I think I could take a shot at it, both for me and for the profession as I understand it, and then you could bounce off that. I think I would add a third name, and I will approach this dialectically, so Hegel will make an appearance. I think Husserl is another one who's had a big impact on cognitive science, and and so I think there's that. Yeah, and so Husserl, Dreyfus, he wrote that book. What was it? It's right on my shelf here. Husserl, AI and Cognitive Science, or something like that. And on that telling, Husserl is kind of like a forefather or foregrounder, precursor to contemporary cognitive science and AI, with all this emphasis on the kind of structure of experience and these kind of rules and representations that must be implicit in experience in order for it to be organized the way it is. And then Dreyfus, of course, is critical of that on Heideggerian and Merleau-Pontyan grounds, seeing something much richer. By the way, I loved your description of what to like in Merleau-Ponty. I think that is really the best part of phenomenology, right? Is treat a world as complete and rich and having this complicated texture. I think all the phenomenologists were committed to that, but Merleau-Ponty was maybe the most evocative in describing this. And I think what Dreyfus saw and what cognitive scientists saw is that when you go beyond Husserl, and I'm going to critique this, but at a first pass, you go beyond Husserl and classical cognitive science. So we've got this lineup, right? Husserl, classical cognitive science. And then now you get like embodied cognitive science critiquing classical cognitive science, and you get Merleau-Ponty on this telling critiquing Husserl. You get this much richer, it's not just the mind representing the world, but mind and world are intertwined. The body is thinking in a certain way. We have this, we're kind of comporting ourselves to situations, and when maintaining optimal grip. There was all this just really suggestive language and discussion about how we inhabit a world that didn't seem to make use of all the classical categories, and that happened to map very nicely onto all of this stuff that started appearing 20 or 30 years ago in embodied cognitive science, right? Both philosophically and psychologically, all these experiments showing that, there's all these ways in which your body is doing things, and the world is doing things that we traditionally thought of as cognition. That you're, when you're solving a long division problem, the pen and paper are as much a part of it as your brain. And when a child is figuring out how to get through a door, their bodies and their legs and the door are as much a part of it as whatever brain circuitry is involved. And the Merleau-Ponty cognitive science really resonates with that. And so I think that's, whereas with someone like Sartre or de Beauvoir, Heidegger's a different case, but there's just much less, as for the reasons Robin already unpacked, right? They weren't as focused on psychology. So Merleau-Ponty's already talking about psychology and anthropology and the human sciences, but in a way that really mapped onto these changes in cognitive science. So I think that's the basis of the appeal.
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe just throw in one other figure who turns up in these discussions sometimes, Hans Jonas. You see him in the sort of Varela-inspired kind of an activist vein, but he's really not super widely read among phenomenologists or continental philosophers either. He's just, I think, somebody who has been rightly picked out by some of the phenomenologically informed sort of people interested in mind and brain and body and environment and their intertwining. So Jonas would be just one other figure that if people are interested in this, they might find some rich material in his work.
Lovely. Just one. This will be the last more like introductory question, but I'm curious, and this is something I've always, I guess, I try to think about critically whenever I do try to bring in philosophy into science. Where would you say, I'm curious, that when one brings in concepts from, let's say, Husserl or Merleau-Ponty, any kind of phenomenology into the cognitive sciences, they go awry. And what I mean by that is, what are the limits of this sort of mapping concepts from philosophy into the sciences? I mean, I know, Jeff, you've done a bit of writing on this. I'm curious, especially when it comes to Merleau-Ponty. I mean, I can think of an example like the body, for example, where, yeah, I mean, when Merleau-Ponty speaks of the body, is it the same kind of body that a cognitive scientist or even an embodied cognitive scientist would speak of? So that's like one example there. Where do you think people should tread carefully in doing this and playing this game, so to speak?
I suspect Jeff and I might have different answers to this, or different intuitions.
That's even better. Great. Yeah, please. I'd love you to flesh it out here.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, there's a line in Merleau-Ponty, I think from the Nature course, that sort of sticks in my mind, where he says that philosophers should not arbitrate for science, right? So what I take him to mean by that is that it's not the task of the philosopher to sort of make decisions within the scope of scientific research about, you know, which answers are superior to which ones and where the experiment really in fact leads in a scientific debate. But a line from another part of the Nature course, you know, but the task of the philosopher is to sort of see behind the scientist's back what they can't see. Right. So there's a really cooperative effort, I think, that Merleau-Ponty sees for philosophers and scientists, where I think it's important to emphasize the cooperation and not the sort of like, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong kind of approach. But the way that I think of that cooperation, like from my own perspective, is that Merleau-Ponty is constantly trying to sort of unsettle what philosophers like to try and settle. And so this kind of constant movement of unsettling what seems settled is for him the task of the philosopher. And so that's going to look very different in different debates. But one of the shapes that often takes is to constantly sort of probe at concepts and oppositions that scientists are working with, and to ask questions like whether the opposition reverses or disappears when seen from another perspective, and are these really binary in the way we take them to be binary, things like active and passive, form and content, necessary and free. So he's just kind of constantly trying to poke at what the scientists are trying to put into neat little boxes and say, you know, maybe that's a nice box, but the phenomenon is overflowing it, and what are other ways we could capture it? That's the work that I see him doing, and I think that's one way to think about how philosophers and scientists can cooperate. This settle and unsettle kind of movement.
Wow, I love that. I have so much to say about that. Let's see if I could track it all. I mean, at a first pass, I think I agree. I like this settling and unsettling metaphor. I think, this goes back to Socrates, right? The gadfly kind of probing and pushing. I mean, critical theory in a way does this today. And philosophers should play that role, and phenomenologists. But I think there should also be periods of settling, like theory building in the middle. You just don't take it too seriously. Like theory building with a sense of humor, maybe, right? Or with a sense of like skepticism, like I could be wrong. So it might just be the same thing, just putting the emphases on different places. The way, I guess my answer to the question, which I believe is compatible with yours, Robin, is maybe this would be like the 1.0 simple answer to the question, is that in traditional phenomenology, going back to Husserl, to the things themselves. I think you were going to ask about this, Rahul, right? You employ reduction or bracketing or epoche, whatever you want to call it. You forget about all your preconceived notions, all the boxes we're stuck in, all the settled opinions we have, to use some of your language, Robin, and just look when I go to dinner in a restaurant, or when I get in an argument with somebody, or when I enjoy a wonderful vacation, just whatever. And when I'm on a podcast, what is it like, right? How is it really, what is this rich texture of life that is occurring? And just describe it as accurately as possible without importing a bunch of other stuff and preconceived commitments and psychological or other theories. And that's the mistake Husserl and others thought was being made, right? It was people are putting together theories based on how it ought to be rather than how it feels to be, how it is. And so, in fact, Gurvitch, who was kind of an intermediary between Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, there's an interesting story there. Part of his dissertation was saying that Gestalt psychology involves an implicit phenomenological reduction. It's saying we're not going to look at perception as just a bunch of points and assume that for each kind of sensory neuron, there's a little pointillistic dot in my experiential screen. But we're going to treat the perception as I think autochthonous is a word they used to use, as a kind of autonomous given that has its own structure, and the structure is the thing. And we could get evidence from other places, and we could build a kind of converging story, but it's kind of phenomenology first. Now, the naturalized neurophenomenological kind of addition to that, which does go in a way a little bit beyond Husserl and other phenomenologists, is to say, well, sometimes the empirical evidence can press on the phenomenology a little. And I kind of like these views that are kind of, again, convergent, mixed. You take it all together. Any part can kind of influence the others. And then you put together the best theory you can with all the evidence you have. But it's good to do that. It's good to sort of be, I think, to be a system builder who tries to put it all together. Going back to the very beginning, I like things in the little boxes, but then to recognize that not everybody should be doing that. There should be people poking and prodding around that, and not ever letting anything be taken too seriously, because we're fallible creatures after all, and that includes phenomenologists.
No doubt. Yeah.
In Merleau-Ponty's case, it would also be, it's just like a sort of reinterrogation of, just to think about like naturalizing phenomenology. The Merleau-Pontian move there is also to say, okay, but what is naturalizing, and what is nature, and what do you mean by that? And so it's not just sort of like poking and prodding and unsettling what happens internal to the science, but really like sort of asking us to bring into the scope of what is questionable some of the like very basic concepts, what is empirical, and where are the limits of the empirical, and is there an opposite to empirical, and is that opposition sustained in all contexts, and things like that.
Of course. The other thing I'd say here is, like, in fact, a lot of scientists, they like to think that they're doing this like almost like as if they're playing this purely empirical game where there isn't any concepts involved. I think it's a flawed notion, because we all implicitly have a theory when we are theorizing. We are all within a certain Weltanschauung or certain worldview when we're doing theory. But there's something really interesting about science, and I think here's where I really think philosophy is useful. Immanent to science itself, there are all of these paradoxes and things we can't explain, and I think we saw that a lot in neuroscience, but also, of course, like in quantum mechanics, there are all these debates going on, like what's, all these contradictions, and that's where this like poking and prodding of philosophers can be super useful. What I love about that is also, it's not like the scientific enterprise, something external to it comes and kind of provokes it. Within itself, something, comes up, which is like, oh, that's a surprising result. Oh, the double slit experiment, that's a bit weird. How are we going to make sense of this? So, notions like that. But also another thing is, when I spoke to Simon Critchley, just on this note, he made a really interesting point. He was like, well, in a way, this is why society will always kind of ostracize the philosopher, because the philosopher is always going to be a bit of like the outsider, kind of like constantly saying how think about it, like in the Socratic way, think about this, reconsider this, what do you mean by that, what do you mean by this, and it can be a bit annoying, and so they can't really be put into a specific contained institution either. It has to be this place of almost the outsider within the inside, so to speak. Beautiful. On that note, and I'd love to hear more about this from you, Robin, and Jeff, you mentioned this probably at the outset of this conversation, the notion of ambiguity in Merleau-Ponty's thought. So I thought we could spend a bit of time just discussing that. So Robin, please, what is this notion of ambiguity in Merleau-Ponty's thought? And please, Jeff, if you could comment afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that follows nicely from this discussion about the relationship of philosophy and science. So, I mean, maybe one way to come at it is to think about some of the examples of ambiguity that Merleau-Ponty himself starts from in places like phenomenology perception. So to take something like an ambiguous figure in Gestalt psychology, so you could think of something like the duck-rabbit illusion, for example, right, as a kind of ambiguous figure where the same image, right, gives rise to two very different kind of perceptual determinations. And I think what's interesting in something like the duck-rabbit illusion is that the question, like, but which is it really, doesn't make sense. It's both, right? And it is sort of the nature of that particular phenomenon to have both possibilities included within it. And you compare that to other kinds of perceptual illusions. So one that Merleau-Ponty references in the beginning of phenomenology is the Muller-Lyer illusion, two measurably equal lines. And when you invert arrows on the end of them, they appear unequal. And here it's very common in psychology to say, okay, well, there is a fact of the matter. They really are equal. They just appear unequal. And I think Merleau-Ponty wants us to resist that tendency to resolve the ambiguity firmly on the side of a fact of the matter and then a distorted appearance. I think he wants us to see that in many ways the lines both are equal and unequal, the same way that the duck-rabbit illusion is both a duck and a rabbit. They are unequal for sight and they are equal for the measuring tool. And so that gives us occasion to sort of say, what is that impulse to resolve the ambiguity and to settle the matter in such a way that the ambiguity becomes explained away? And I think he's worried about a tendency in the sciences and in much of the history of philosophy to seek those moments of resolution, to say, but what is it really? And he wants philosophers to sort of cultivate a feeling for ambiguity as ambiguity. And this becomes for him a sort of a wider, both methodological and then ontological thought. When he sees a number of sort of common oppositions, subject-object, free and determined, active-passive, and he finds instances where sort of one term of a binary is made more foundational, and finds ways in which you could sort of flip things around, right? Things that look passive can be seen as active from another perspective. And so for him, the methodological point there is to find where a phenomenon that seems determinable in one way could be determined in another, where the other way opposes the first. That's a methodological sort of feeling for ambiguity. But ultimately, I think he comes to the conclusion that that ambiguity has to be more fundamental than any of the resolutions that it gives rise to. And that becomes, I think, not just a methodological point, but an ontological one. The way that he thinks about nature and the physical world is as something that where form and content are ambiguous, where freedom and determinism are ambiguously intertwined. I'll stop there. But that's how I think about what ambiguity means in a variety of Merleau-Pontian contexts.
Okay, so I just want to reiterate like what I said at the beginning. Like, this is great. Like, this just unlocks the text so nicely for me. It starts off with this very concrete examples from psychology, and it's it helps make sense of, I guess we'll be talking about some of the later work and chiasm, if I'm saying it right, and flesh and so forth. So as a mode of interpretation, I'm 100% on board. In terms of, since I think the way I approach things is a bit of, I don't know if Merleau-Ponty has a lot of targets in mind, but I'm probably among them ultimately. I do think, I'll put a little pressure on this. In the case of the Muller-Lyer illusion, you could say, well, they're different in terms of perception, but the same in terms of a measuring device. And you've now got a kind of theory, right? You've laid out, or the duck, the duck rabbit, you could see it as a duck, you could see it as a rabbit, you can gather statistics, you could prime to see duck more than rabbit. And we could learn a lot by empirical investigation and then write it all down. And it's like, well, here's our theory of the duck rabbit illusion in humans or in some population of animals. And, we see this all through Husserl. I mean, his background's in, calculus and these giant possibility spaces and like the calculus of variation. And you've got this huge manifold of all these possibilities. And you find the one that minimizes a function or something. It's a complicated thing with lots of ambiguity in it, in the sense of lots of different ways it could be, but you could give a kind of structured analysis of all those possibilities. And the horizon theory is like that. I think, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, Merleau-Ponty is writing before all these debates, right? He's not clearly like Husserl is wrong in any of this. I think he's just, and this is now maybe a more compatibilist line. You could see that as ambiguity, I think productively. I do like that. Or you could see it as here's a complicated structure of possibilities that we can work out. Now, having said all that, I still want to say, like as a footnote, it's important that, not for Husserl to get the type of Husserlian, not for me, I guess, to get too confident and say, and that's it, that's all, folks. I do, again, think this destabilizing is important. And if I could add one footnote, Rahul, you mentioned oftentimes we have ideological prejudices. We can't do this thing of just describing things exactly as they are. And I recently read Adorno's Against Epistemology, which is basically a book-length attack on Husserl, where he's making this point. So Hegel's going to come in here again. And it's like you say you're describing things just as they are. I'm sorry, this is a slight digression, but you say you're describing things just as they are, but you've got all kinds of stuff in your head, even when you say you're doing that. I think that's true too, and this is the reason I bring it up, because that's another case where I'm being kind of self-critical here. It's like we could put together our stable theories. I think that's helpful. It's nice to have a textbook explanation of the Muller-Lyer illusion and what's known about it, but I think we ought to keep the Merleau-Pontys and the Adornos around, keeping pressure on it. And we're never going to do a pure phenomenological reduction. We're always going to have some ideology, but we could do our best, gather a lot of evidence, and kind of come to sort of the best conversion account we can.
I promise this will be the only interruption. In the past few years, I truly have cherished connecting with all you listeners of this podcast, whether through email, video calls, or simply the comments. And I'd hate to lose this fledgling community we've built around our shared love for philosophy and science, and so I'm kindly asking you to consider subscribing to this podcast on Substack. Let's cut the BS. In our techno-feudalist times, no platform is perfect, and at the end of the day, these companies own us. However, if I may naively be hopeful, Substack at least allows me to export email addresses for me to keep connected with you all if one of these platforms decides to kick me off for some reason, which, as we're well aware, they've done in the past with no explanation. In fact, this almost happened to me recently. So please, let's stay connected through Substack, and if all else fails, at least the good old SMT protocol. That is a nerdy joke for you programmers out there. Hegel always, seeps in his head from somewhere. He can never get rid of Hegel.
He's all over Merleau-Ponty.
Yeah, that's right. The dissertation, you said, right.
Yeah. I mean, and so that sort of generation of phenomenologists, I mean, they got their Heidegger through, Kojève, which is really just Hegel. They got Hegel through Kojève, which is the sort of Heidegger Hegel, and it's the other way. They got their Hegel through Kojève, which is a Heideggerian Hegel and a very particular kind of one, and the Hegelian kind of moves show up, and structure behavior has got Hegelian moves all over it, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of Hegelians on this podcast, and a lot of them are, in fact, I wouldn't say critical, but they say that Kojève was a brilliant philosopher in his own right, but his reading of Hegel, they claim, is quite they went wrong with it. Yeah, idiosyncratic kind of Hegel, and that's why a lot of these phenomenologists also were almost opposing Hegel against Hegel in his kind of this big systematic thinking and whatnot. But look, I'm going to ask this question here. It really wasn't in my notes, but I think you both probably would love to comment on this a bit. The preface to the Phenomenology of Perception, not Spirit, that was Hegel, Phenomenology of Perception, was probably that little preface, not little, well, it's a little bit big, is some of the best philosophy I've read in my life. And that I've truly enjoyed reading that. Just the preface to that book itself is worth starting on the book. And yeah, Merleau-Ponty, in fact, asks the question, what is phenomenology? And then he says it's the study of essences, and according to it, all problems amount to finding definitions of essences. I'm wondering, can you comment a bit on that little, how he starts off the preface by this saying that phenomenology is the study of essences?
Yeah, it's funny because the preface was added as a sort of afterthought because he got the feedback after handing in the first draft of the Phenomenology of Perception that his readers might not know what phenomenology was. And so he wrote the preface, which is why it begins with that actually kind of snarky first line, right? Like, you may wonder why we have to ask this question.
I should say there, though, he's probably one of those rare philosophers who knew their audience, because most philosophers wouldn't have that consideration.
Yeah. But I mean, I think the preface is so good at capturing what is so difficult about Merleau-Ponty and what is so brilliant about him, which is that you have to follow all of the moves all the way through, right? So he's sort of speaking in a Husserlian voice in that fragment that you quote, that it's the study of essences, and then he modulates into his Heidegger voice and says, and his Sartre voice, and says, but essence is put back into existence. And so there's this kind of swing, and where he wants to settle is not in the middle, but sort of prior to that opposition, right? So I think what that preface is trying to do is to pose the question, from what or in what context or in what way or how could essence and existence emerge as seemingly opposed categories? And he doesn't want to choose between one of those or the other, but to understand how that opposition could emerge. And for him, that's what phenomenology is trying to do. So it's the study of essences, but the study of essences as they emerge from existence, but not a raw material existence, an existence that is already, pregnant with the possibility of essentializing. And that is what he thinks the study of, or the phenomenological sort of lingering on perception can put us into contact with. And so it's a kind of swinging movement, right, where you end up underneath the opposition, which is a sort of Hegelian thing.
I was smiling there because I was just thinking, if I would have loved to have hear you say that, it would have helped me so much to hear somebody say what you just said, Robin. Like back in the early 90s when I first started reading this stuff. I did not have your experience, Rahul, of this great text. I found it maddening. Dreyfus did signal this, something you said separately, that wait, he's saying something else. He's not necessarily endorsing it. It's not always clear what perspective Merleau-Ponty's taking. I think, he's in these different voices, as you put it. Phenomenology as a study of essences was Husserl's way of characterizing the field, starting around maybe 1905 or around there. And it's a very technical approach, and we can talk more about it if you like, but I do, saying that it's been modulated into a Heideggerian voice and then a Sartrean voice, and this pendulum is swinging at something beyond it, kind of like our discussion of ambiguity. It's not one or the other, resist that tendency. I find very useful.
And there's this tendency that when people try and capture that move, which is all over Merleau-Ponty, there's this tendency to describe what he does as like a third way. And I think that leads, I mean, that's not wrong, but I think it invites the interpretation that he's sort of splitting the difference between like the Husserl side and the Heidegger side. And I don't think that quite gets at what he's doing, right? He's trying to get like underneath the opposition that they sort of come down on different sides of. So the third way language is not wrong, but I worry about it a little bit. That wasn't your language, Jeff, but that just made me think that it comes up a lot.
Yeah, and I easily could have gone there. I mean, so my first thing was like, well, I would put like TBR in the margins, to be rejected, or, this is not what, and then, oh, this is what Merleau-Ponty thinks. And wait, no, does he? But, and then I easily could have done some third way thing. But yeah, this more dynamic approach is useful. I will say another footnote. It was great that I didn't know that like an editor or something or a viewer said, you got to put something in here. Husserl, like his published work, often it's like there's some long hundreds of pages of kind of setup. And I like the phenomenology where it's like, let's talk about the body, right? Or in Merleau-Ponty or the artist or the body and its sexual being or Schneider or some experiment or in Husserl time or in Heidegger care, like actual phenomenology instead of all the preliminaries. So it's interesting all the major texts have these big, confusing introductions. But I'm glad you liked it, Rahul. Yeah.
Oh no, I've got to say, I think one part I enjoyed is because I'm not like an expert phenomenologist, just more like a neophyte. I enjoyed the ambiguity because it gave me more of like, it was like almost like a stepping stone to look into all of these other thinkers. Because Merleau-Ponty was the first phenomenologist I read. Even before Heidegger, I read Merleau-Ponty because of his absorption into cognitive science. And yeah, for me, it's that preface has been a big part in my life as like a student, but also just as I would say a human being even. Yeah, on the note of kind of speaking of the bit of the cognitive sciences, I want to discuss this one point you made in the email you sent to us, Jeff, just regarding both of your previous conversation, like the kind of the summary you did, which was, and I'm really curious to probably get into a bit of the differences between you both here. You said, and I'm just gonna quote you verbatim here because it's easier. You said, "I described my tendency to give the phenomenology as informed by cognitive science priority. And then if that means I stray from what Merleau-Ponty means, that's fine." So if you could probably firstly outline a bit, Jeff, what is like for you this cog-sci informed phenomenology? I know you kind of discussed this, but just for this episode. And then perhaps, Robin, you could say where your disagreements are and how that'll differ to what, if there is such a thing, a authentic Merleau-Pontian phenomenology.
Yeah, this was a really nice upshot of these conversations, and I think we might even publish something on it. I'm hopeful. I don't think this is really
That would be lovely.
A disagreement as just a difference in research projects, complementary research projects. And the background on this for me is, is again Dreyfus. It keeps going back to Dreyfus. What was so great about Dreyfus is he would be up there on stage. And he was really in the thing, he would think about somebody who would say, well, when I drive a car, this is what, and he'd like scratch his head and just think, and you could tell he wasn't like, no, let's figure out what the text says. He was like, let's figure out what's really the case here, right? To the things himself, again. And, if Heidegger's wrong, so be it, right? It's not like we have to rescue every line of Heidegger. And I have the same approach to Husserl. Husserl makes mistakes. Husserl's wrong. There is all this idea. Adorno is right. There's all this ideology all the time. Hegel is right. We never have this completely free, unconstrained, unbiased view of the world. And so we make mistakes. And in fact, there's a lot of great work happening in Husserlian epistemology lately that shows how Husserl kind of accepted that. So kind of rescue on Husserl for that. So from that standpoint, when I approach Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, any phenomenologist, I'm finding what I find rich and informative in it, and then I'm trying to fit it into my big, system with all the cognitive science and the neuroscience and the psychology. I am kind of a systematic philosopher. I want to get this sort of growing, accumulating neurophenomenological story. And if that means that I disagree with a phenomenologist somewhere, that's fine. And so this, I think, will come up later in this discussion of all the later Merleau-Ponty and what to make of all that stuff and how I could make use of it. In making use of it the way I would make use of it, I think I'm probably straying from Merleau-Ponty at a certain point, but that's okay. And then now I'm going to try and describe this, Robin, and just correct me. I think Robin is a kind of perfect symmetrical counterpart where the project is more historical. Let's see all the twists and turns that Merleau-Ponty or some philosophers thought went through. And if it's not right, it doesn't matter because that's not the project. It's a historical project. And then my only other comment about it is these two kind of complementary, ambiguously vacillating, penduluming projects are complementary, right? By looking at the details of historical development, that might suggest some new phenomena. Or if something's a little weird in terms of the phenomena, well, let's be charitable. Maybe we should interpret it a little differently or see if there's some other way to read it. So I think it's great that both of these approaches exist and they can kind of cross-pollinate.
Yeah, no, I think that captures it really well. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm less interested in the mind or brain or perception than I'm interested in texts, and Merleau-Ponty wrote some texts that I'm obsessed with figuring out, and I'm interested in figuring out how they fit together, and I'm interested in the idea that texts emerge in a context, in a world. So how do we chart those connections? Why did Merleau-Ponty think the things that he thought in the arrangement that he thought them? So I don't think of it as like a narrowly historical project, but certainly the center of gravity is what is trying to understand Merleau-Ponty rather than trying to figure out whether what he said is true and supported by the science. So a lot of my work that has sort of been at the intersection of phenomenology and cognitive science has less been interested in moving the sort of the science forward and more interested in figuring out whether the things that are done in Merleau-Ponty's name are in fact Merleau-Pontian. Not because I think there's something deeply important for the science in that, in figuring that out, but because I think there's something important for understanding the text. What he would and wouldn't endorse or go on to say. So yeah, in some ways it's the perfect inversion of, when confronted with a choice, Jeff and I hold on to opposite things.
Yeah, I try to be a vulgar synthesis, and I try to stay on both camps, because I too very much do enjoy, certainly not at your level, but just going through all the texts and trying to pulling my hair out. What does this mean? Almost like an hermeneutical project. But at the same time, I almost revere science, so I have to always see, can I look at this from like through a scientific lens? But that's lovely. On the note, I'm curious, Robin, and Jeff, you wrote an excellent paper on this, the paper Prospects for a Naturalized Phenomenology. So on the project of Naturalized Phenomenology, as like let's call it more like a bona fide Merleau-Ponty and Robin, what are your views on this project that kind of started off in the 80s and 90s called Naturalized Phenomenology?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have a little slogan in my head, and it's not mine, and I apologize that I can't remember who I stole it from. So if you figure it out, let me know. But it's something like a naturalized phenomenology is not possible for Merleau-Ponty without phenomenologizing nature. And I think that's really important, that if you leave intact a certain picture of nature as a sort of like law-governed, disenchanted space of externally related objects, or whatever the sort of standard formulation is, including some of the critical important revisions to that account of nature that have come in the many years in which cognitive science has existed. Using that pretty traditional framework of naturalism, I don't think Merleau-Ponty would see the prospects for a naturalized phenomenology very positively. But if it's cooperating with a project of sort of rethinking what is natural, what falls within the scope of the natural, what nature as a concept designates and what it could designate, what kind of events and forces could be natural, if it's coupled with that kind of interrogation of the framework of the natural sciences and the concepts that it works with, then I think there are much more positive prospects. And so, I think that there's a real diversity of work that happens under the heading of naturalizing phenomenology, some of which very explicitly does not engage in a critical interrogation of the concept of nature, and some of which does. And I think the former category, the one where we're just sort of not rethinking what natural science is, but just seeing if we can borrow tools from phenomenology to make it better, that strikes me as not a very Merleau-Pontian project. But that doesn't mean there isn't room for a sort of naturalization of Merleau-Pontian phenomenology if we're sufficiently expansive about what the natural might mean.
Yeah, I like that. I hope we get into the later Merleau-Ponty, and then Robin has this kind of continuity theory, which I like, that it's sort of one project throughout, and that includes this idea, this romantic conception in the Schelling sense. Although I guess he had some critical things to say about Schelling, that nature is kind of alive, and that if I run my hand across the desk is feeling my hand as much as the hand is feeling the desk, and so forth. Those are very provocative and interesting remarks. And this is maybe where the rubber hits the road or something, or the road hits the road. I don't know. But yeah, I would take all that as really rich phenomenology. I would probably read that somewhat metaphorically, personally. But, I think if you're doing honest phenomenology, there are phenomena like that. And, there's this been thread through the conversation of foundations. You mentioned quantum mechanics, Rahul, and Robin, you mentioned the very concept of the natural. And of course, Husserl does that kind of thing too. He talks about, well, if you're going to be an empiricist, what is empiricism, and he's got a whole book, right, on with multiple books, I think, with nature in the title and the phenomenology of nature. And so I take all this to be really good phenomenology of nature, but then when it's all done, I still treat it as the phenomenology, and then I understand it all within a pretty broad contemporary standard naturalistic framework. So that's maybe where I kind of go against Merleau-Ponty, and maybe I think these are things that maybe Husserl wouldn't have liked either in what I do. So that's where I'm maybe doing my own thing, and I think that's okay, right? I mean, naturalized phenomena. I think some people, there are those who want to just make everything like it has to fit, or it has to be kind of phenomenologically kosher. But I think we could press here and there. I guess I've said enough.
Yeah, I guess a lot turns on what you want a naturalistic explanation to look like, and that's something that I wish sort of more people were explicit about when they use language of naturalizing phenomenology, because to some people that means you need the quantifiable laws that govern the processes that we're trying to capture here, and for other people it just means, I don't know, anything that a natural scientist could study, and where that's left open and loose. So I guess I just wish there were more critical discussion about what we expect a naturalized phenomenology to look like. That discussion is certainly happening, but I just wish that it were
no doubt, yeah,
or returned to more frequently.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly want to get into this. In the same paper, you kind of mentioned that Merleau-Ponty isn't talking about. In the same paper, I'm talking about this, your paper, Robin, Merleau-Ponty and the Radical Sciences of Mind. Mm-hmm. You talk about that. Merleau-Ponty isn't following like an activist approach or a pragmatic kind of thought, but rather he is moving towards an ontology of the flesh. I'd love to discuss that. But just one point on something that, Jeff, you mentioned, this. Yeah, I guess this is more of like a historical question. So has Merleau-Ponty got this progressive development in his thought, or is there like a line of thought throughout his career in all of his texts? Where do you see that, Robin?
So yeah, I think there's a real continuity. I think that what sometimes look like twists and turns are just attempts to get a better hold on something that has sort of slipped out of his grasp a little bit. And a lot of this has to do with how I think he thinks about ambiguity. So when you have a phenomenon, for example, say, take an opposition that a lot of phenomenologists are sort of interested in disrupting and dismantling, like a subject-object opposition, right? And so there's sort of standard line in Merleau-Ponty would be to say, okay, well, one of the things that he and other phenomenologists do is sort of to talk about the body as a place where the distinction between subject and object becomes blurred, right? The body is both a subject and an object in different ways at the same time. So it is it is prior to the distinction. And then Merleau-Ponty has all sorts of things to say about how that distinction takes shape through the body and embodied perception. And that's the sort of thought that structures a lot of phenomenology perception. But then I think there's another part of Merleau-Ponty that says, okay, but then what is the body, right? That has this intertwining. Is the body something that is there a something prior to the body, right? That from which it emerges and from which it emerges as other than something else. And I think flesh then becomes something like the deeper category, out of which embodied subjects in all the ambiguity that embodied subjectivity implies emerge, and out of which the rest of like the natural world emerges, so that the opposition between like the human and the world is rooted in a prior kind of ambiguous unity. And I think flesh is supposed to play that role. He calls it a kind of elemental being. So it's sort of like when he moves from phenomenology perception into the visible, the invisible, and starts to talk about flesh, and he has this line where he says, the problems of phenomenology perception were insoluble. And a lot of people say, okay, so he's turning to a different project, starting again. I think what he's really just trying to do is like get behind where he had started from in phenomenology perception, so that there's really a continuity of what he's up to. He's just starting a little bit earlier, digging underneath, figuring out what the distinctions he's been working with are rooted in. And this really wonderful image at the end of that text, he says, maybe we're doing something like a transcendental geology, right? That like we have to get, deeper into history, deeper into the material world, deeper into the flesh of nature, than even the visible and the invisible takes us. So that's how I see the trajectory, is sort of always trying to find what's underneath what he had discovered in an earlier text. I'm not sure if that was too sort of imagistic, and but
No, I'm just letting it settle in my mind because I'm not too familiar with I haven't read The Visible and the Invisible, so there's nothing much I can say here. Jeff, if you want to respond to that more.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm starting with a student to work on a project where in our the student I mentioned, Beza, we worked on phenomenology perception in the case of Schneider in our last paper, and we're working on a new one where we're looking at chiasm and reversibility and flesh and the visible and the invisible, and so this is very interesting to me. It's great to again have this kind of key to the text. It's very helpful to think of it as being a continuous project. I like this image of element. I like how you put it, Robin, that often there's this image, and I get that, like this image kind of forms and you just kind of have to work out what is meant by it without trying to settle it into something. And this is where our differing approaches, I think, would manifest. So in this paper I'm going to write, I'm still going to be thinking of it as that here I am with my body and my brain. I accept, we could talk about this, there's different kinds of representations. I think there are some very simple kinds of representations that are innocuous. This was always my fight with Dreyfus, was on this. There's another kind of representation which is more problematic, which I think Dreyfus and others anchored on. And I think even within a pretty conventional, even cognitivist framework, like literally there's like representations and this is the body and that's not the body, we could still capture a lot of this. I think there's still a lot of profit for someone like me in this kind of work. I mean, I think really, you just look at, an insect crawling around in an environment, or, a human, again, interacting with the environment, and I'll lose track of what's what, and rubber handle. I mean, there's all these psychological cases, alien hands, somatoparaphrenia, derealization. There are all kinds of cases, all these kind of edge cases that show that we can lose track of the distinction between ourselves and the other. And the body is a kind of mediator between the experience of the world and the experience of ourself. And the boundaries of the self are fluid and flexible. They're normally pretty clear, but they come apart. And so I think it's fascinating to be able to take this, to be like, I could say something about this, and probably at the Merleau-Ponty conference or the E4 Embodied and Activist conference, there would be a large contingent of people who would be like, no, that sounds wrong. And that's fine. That's normal. That's scientific discourse or intellectual discourse. But I'm still profiting from it, right? I still think there's this common ground of the things themselves, the phenomena, these rich images. Like throughout his career, Merleau-Ponty is always seeing important things. I'm just receiving them in a pretty traditional kind of framework.
I think the worry, just to stand up for Merleau-Pontyans at this imagined conference, right? Just because I wouldn't want to downplay just how seriously Merleau-Ponty took the science. It was not his critical sort of orientation to the sciences is not, the sort of standing outside and saying, look how silly it is that they think that their empirical results can yield true insight, over here when we're doing real phenomenology. We know it's not that sort of attitude. But I think there's a move that he's constantly trying to guard against, right? So, and it's clearest in the phenomenology of perception, especially the way that we think about the body, right? So part of what Merleau-Ponty is trying to get at is the idea that even to think about the body as a thing extended in space that has certain boundaries that are marked out by the skin, for example, and that, inside the body are certain biological processes and outside it are ones that, so on and so on and so forth. That concept is an achievement of human cognition, and that achievement is the achievement of human cognition that is embodied. And so the body as a medium of experience precedes the concept of the body. And so to then take the concept of the body and sort of like reinsert it in your explanation as what's accounting for perception, when the body as a concept is a result of perceptual experience, that move, and I don't know if I'm totally capturing the worry, but that move is the one that Merleau-Ponty's nervous about science constantly making, that the results of embodied experience, lived experience, are then interpolated as foundational for a theory of embodied experience. And that is just sort of like slipping in underneath the floorboards, right? Something that, at the explanatory level, something that the origins of those concepts is what we really need to understand. So how does the concept of the body emerge from embodied experience? That's what Merleau-Ponty is interested in, not how does experience depend upon the body as a particular kind of entity that science could explain.
So if I could just say quickly, I really like that. I think this is very much in line with Husserl, right? That kind of mistake is precisely what Husserl was trying to guard against with the reduction. This idea of importing in some pre-theoretical idea of sensation or the body or how, the world as a bunch of relations between facts is, or a manifold of symbols, like saying that's reality. No, that's not where you should start. And science makes a mistake when it does that. I'm hoping that I am at like a further dialectical stage, right, where I've accepted that and thought about all the mistakes that could be made in that kind of mode. And then still, like, it really is like, in a long conversation, something settles and then there's the next view. And I think Husserl and Merleau-Ponty were right to do this. Whoa, I just lost lights. The gods still like what I'm saying. Merleau-Ponty heard me. But even
smited.
Right. but even after you go through all that, like, I don't think we want to wind up in a place where we make no use of these traditional concepts. I think they have a place in a suitably phenomenologically kind of oriented inquiry. And so I guess that's sort of big picture for me.
Yeah.
And let me try, and I'm going to turn the light on. I'll be right back. Oh, okay.
Yeah, totally fine.
There it is.
It's back. Yeah, totally fine. So, okay, I think I'm sort of grokking where you both are getting at, but I'm curious. So, like, is what we should focus on? Is, Robin, you're saying like the chiasm, as you put it, or like the chiasmic logic of the flesh? Is that also like the kind of the Merleau-Ponty's notion of a body? I mean, I'm if you could flesh that bit out a bit, no pun intended.
Yeah, let me start with like kind of a sketch of what I take the chiasm concept to be very generally, and then I'll kind of work back to
yes, that'd be great. Yes, please.
That helps in the case of the body. So Merleau-Ponty uses the image of the chiasm, which he is aware has sort of two interestingly related kind of etymological valences, right? So the chiasm is I think that I might get this wrong. I'm not a scientist, but it's like the crossing of optic nerves at the base of the brain or something like that. And there's the crossing of nerves that creates a little blind spot. So what Merleau-Ponty is interested in there is this image of the crossing of nerves that make vision possible, where at the moment of crossing, vision is impossible, right? So the blind spot that makes vision possible. So he's very interested in that image of the chiasm as an optical concept. There's also a rhetorical sense of chiasm. So it's a move that happens a lot in poetry where basically a phrase is inverted and you get this kind of like, so that's this image of it like almost like overlapping. So he's sort of interested in the connection between these two things. And that gives the second, the rhetorical sense of chiasm, sort of gives rise to an association between two concepts in Merleau-Ponty's thought, chiasm and reversibility. I mean, often these are used interchangeably, that when he's talking about the chiasm, he's talking about reversible structures, and that it has something to do with the nature of perception. So he must be talking about the way that when we perceive, we are being perceived, or the sensing can be sensed, and so on and so forth. That's the sort of general picture. And I like to think of it this way. Often when you say reversibility and you think about Merleau-Ponty talking about reversibility, a common example people will give is like, imagine a piece of paper, right? And it has two sides and it's reversible, right? The two sides are inseparable, right? It's a distinction that is also a unity, and that distinction is flippable. I don't think that quite gets at it. I like to think of a piece of paper that's been folded in half. And so you have two sides of the paper are now touching. And in that fold, in that crease, there is this little bit that's not one side or another, but the sort of condition of possibility of them touching, right? The fold in the paper doesn't belong to either side of the folded paper, but is how they touch. And that's like the blind spot for him that makes vision possible. It's the gap that makes touching possible. So all of our sensory capacities have this structure where there's the gap that makes the sensible connection or the sensibility possible. That's what I think chiasm is for him. And so what's interesting is, so he talks about, that the body that perceives, right, can perceive itself as object, but there's always part of what its objective being that it cannot see. Like at the gap where my head is, I cannot see, right, except in the mirror. And then when I'm looking in the mirror, there's the backside that I can't see. So there's something that's always hidden. So this is the sort of like relationship between invisibility and visibility. But there's always you can exchange what's hidden and what's not hidden. That's the reversibility. But something always remains hidden as a condition of possibility of seeing. And so that structure, right, where what belongs to one side or the other of an opposition can switch or can move or can shift, but where there's always a gap that makes that shift possible. That's the structure of the flesh for him. It's the structure of the body. It's the structure of nature. That's the sort of foundational, I think, structural element for him that the chiasm is trying to capture. So with the body, I can conscript aspects of the material world into the sphere of subjectivity. The blind person with the cane is an extension of their sensory capacity. I can constrain my body down to a point when I push on the edge of the desk, right? My bodily being is concentrated in that point of contact, and the rest of my body sort of like dissipates into the surrounding environment. So there's a real shift in what belongs to my body as a medium of subjectivity and what belongs to the experienced world. But there's always something on the side of the body and something on the side of the world that are always in a relation. That's how I understand the chiasm.
Could I ask a follow-up on this?
Yeah.
So like this romantic conception of nature that I mentioned before, which again, intuitively, I think of it as in terms of the German idealists and, being out in the
Shelling.
Shelling, and I'm up in Yosemite, and it's alive, right? Just as I am. And then also these specific statements like the painter is being seen by the panorama as much as the painter sees the panorama. Could you expand on those two themes a little? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is part. Well, let me put this in two ways. I think that it would be a mistake to say that Merleau-Ponty is endorsing the kind of totally animated, alive in the strong sense of nature that those sort of images suggest. I don't think he's going for the totally re-enchanted kind of picture there. What I'm trying to capture when I use the language of a romantic concept of nature, though, is the idea that nature is filled with meaningfulness intrinsically, without the human being the source of that meaningfulness. So meaningfulness that precedes and is outside of a human imposition, and that meaningfulness in the natural world, the way in which it is available to the human as something filled with meaning, is, to put this one way, an active participant or a constraint on how the human can make sense of that world. So the concepts that we develop to understand the natural world are in part concepts that bear the trace of the world in which they take shape. So they are the natural world is filled with a certain kind of meaningfulness, and that meaningfulness is irreducible. It cannot be reduced away in trying to make sense of the world.
And this is where he departs a little bit from some of the ecological psychologists and the radical embodied cognitive science folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not entirely confident that I've been able to capture that difference or that departure in the most charitable or helpful terms, but I've drawn a distinction in my work between a kind of pragmatic ontology and the romantic ontology. And what I'm trying to get at by that distinction is, when I use the language of a pragmatic ontology, I mean that the natural world or the world outside, to put it in a problematic way, is meaningful for action, right? So that it has meaning that can be sort of like unlocked at the intersection of like the human who tries to navigate and make use of the world and move through the world. So, the ledge is for sitting, the water is
the affordances.
Yeah, right. The affordance language, where there's a kind of like instrumental value that the body can attune to, And I think that, and so the instrumentality of meaning there, like that it's the 4x that is sort of what I'm trying to get at with the language of the pragmatic. I think that the romantic conception has a richer sense of meaningfulness than that. It's not just what does the world afford my doing, but something much richer than that. And so there are certain quasi-romantic thinkers. I'm thinking people like Herder, who are referenced very occasionally in Phenomenology, Perception, and elsewhere, that I think he has in mind here. Herder is the person he mentions explicitly when he tries to get at this romantic concept of quality. And Herder has some really interesting things to say about this kind of point in talking about physics. For instance, Herder makes this argument that the concepts that are foundational in physics sort of are rooted in the human experience of the body. Mass is a yearning for the center, as he puts it. That's, I think, what Merleau-Ponty is getting at. So it's not that, the water is for drinking, the mountain is for climbing, but that the very terms we have to understand the natural world are terms that bear the traces of our naturalness and the world that formed our natural bodies. I'm not sure if I'm quite putting that.
That was very helpful. Yeah.
That was lovely. Thank you. I mean, I think especially I've got to re-listen to this and probably even write something up on this, the delineation you made between pragmatic ontology versus the romantic ontology. I'm just going to say a bit of a provocative point here. If like someone like a Derridean, they would probably call the pragmatic ontology phallogocentric. You want to use nature, like, you want to kind of like the Baconian sense where, the world affords itself to us so that we can use it for our own being. And in fact, just to flesh this out a bit more, I think I find it quite interesting because I read Sean Gallagher's book, An Activist Interventions, and obviously Sean Gallagher was deeply influenced. He's an activist, but also deeply influenced by Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. And when I read that book, one thought I had was, I mean, he makes this beautiful connection between an activism and pragmatism, American pragmatism, from Peirce to Dewey and all of them. But I realized that, like, in a way, what the anactivists outline, that theory can in itself just be completely compatible with something like pragmatism or even like ecological psychology. And I was always wondering, like, why even bring in phenomenology to it? Because they, I think, very much outline kind of like a pragmatic ontology in the inactivist sense. Whereas even though like Varela and all of them were deeply influenced by Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, so it's just, I think that, that was really useful, that the way you sketched that out there. Lovely.
I think that's a really important point. I asked sorry, you're cutting off. I don't know. I cut you off because it.
No, go ahead, please. It's fine. Yeah.
No, I think that's a really important point that you're making. And I asked, I have a colleague who's sort of a very committed Deweyan, sees Dewey everywhere. I see Merleau-Ponty everywhere. And he gave a really wonderful talk. And at a certain point, in the Q&A, I raised my hand and I said, this is a mean question, but like, why Dewey? Like, you could have just said everything you said with Merleau-Ponty. And his answer was, I like Dewey. But I think that, so there are some ways in which, Merleau-Ponty is taken up in the context that we've been talking about here, where like, it could have been Dewey that you're writing about. Because there are a lot of things that resonate between them. But I'm committed to the idea that Merleau-Ponty is doing something much more than that. And that we ought to devote some resources to understanding what that more is. And that's what I'm trying to sort of get at.
No, in fact, that was my point, that latter bit, you put it succinctly. Because I was trying to understand, like, what's Merleau-Ponty and that phenomenological tradition all about? And that's what kind of interests me in that way. I think one part I want to discuss now probably is the pluralist approach that you outlined, Jeff. I mean, that's, in fact, before I even read any of your work, Robin, I read this paper on the pluralist approach by Jeff, and that's when I was like, oh, this would be a really interesting conversation to have on phenomenology and cognitive science. Yeah, I mean, I haven't really got any specific questions. I'm wondering, Jeff, if you could just outline your argument in that paper you wrote with, is it Beza?
Beza Cavus.
Beza Cavus, a pluralist approach to Merleau-Ponty cognitive science. And then probably, Robin, you could probably just respond to it too.
Yeah, I think this would be a good exercise because it'll sort of allow us to retrace some of what we've done in this conversation.
Yes, lovely.
And see where the contrasts are. And it illustrates a lot of what I was saying, so that the background on this, again, to go back to Dreyfus, I didn't know he would show up so much today, but Dreyfus would say these things about, Heidegger and the ready to hand and comporting to situations and drawing on Merleau-Ponty and things like optimal grip. And he would say, look, we're not walking around, like I don't walk through the door and say, that is a door, that is a doorknob, I will now open the doorknob. And I think he's right. We don't do that. We just open the door. But I think the mistake to me that's made there is to say, well, what representation is explicitly, focally looking at something and kind of in a propositionally structured event, receiving it. So it's just, everything is like a proposition that you think about. That clearly seems like bad phenomenology. It's the problem you mentioned before, Robin, right, of importing like a language of thought, a computational theory of a certain kind, like a Fodorian theory, into phenomenology in a problematic way. And so that was a lot of my early fight with Dreyfus, and I think that kind of worked itself. I worked that out, and then that worked its way through my take on some of these topics in Merleau-Ponty. And the idea was is that, so consider the case of Schneider. So Schneider couldn't do certain things like pointing to his nose or describing things in a kind of abstract way. But if he had to, if there was something on his nose, he could swat it away or grab it. And so this has been a lot of interest to interpreters, right? Because there's some sort of one kind of behavior, a much more embodied kind of ready-to-hand behavior is available to him, but a certain kind of abstracted behavior is not. And what does that tell us? And so my read on that is, so to make sense of that, we introduced two kinds of representation, right? There's a representation in this very explicit sense, like what I was saying in Dreyfus, but maybe not such a straw man sense. Like, so really, I think there's multiple concepts here. There's sort of being explicit about things, like calling things out, calling attention to them. And then there's just doing things. And in both cases, I think there's a kind of representational structure you could see when you just walk through a door or type on the keyboard without thinking of it or tie your shoes. There is what Merleau-Ponty calls a kind of typical physiognomy to it, right? Every time you walking through the door doesn't feel like tying your shoes. Beating some eggs when you're making omelets doesn't feel like tying your shoes either. It feels like you're beating some eggs. And there are certain like neural patterns that are, kind of reactivated every time you do it, when you walk through a door or beat some eggs or tie your shoes. So there is some connections to be made, I think, between internal structures in the brain and these everyday activities. And when you're making those connections, when you're doing this other somewhat non-phenomenological project, this naturalized neurophenomenological project, I think it helps to link the sort of embodied behavior with the kinds of patterns that occur. And then by looking at them both, you could refine both and do this whole kind of convergent project I've been talking about. And then there's a whole nother stratum of active, explicit representations evolved. So think of, again, you're making omelets and you're making them with a friend and you say, hey, could you chop up the onions? Could you chop up the bell peppers? Would you mind taking the pan for a little bit while I go get, some chives from the garden or something? So we're kind of periodically making these, using language to make explicit statements, and those get kind of woven in to the activity as well. And those are subserved by different kinds of circuits in the brain that are nicely dissociated. And then in the specific case of Schneider, it seems like there's one particular stratum of these explicit representations that is impaired. And there's this very nice convergence. We could look at the literature on visual agnosia, which it seems that Schneider had, And so we looked very carefully at those texts. So it was just case study is an input into the kind of, naturalized phenomenology. But then you look at what Merleau-Ponty says, and it's this rich, suggestive stuff of there's a kind of virtual space that is absent in Schneider. You can't sort of think of like a sci-fi movie or like there's a heads-up display with coordinates like that. You can tell me to draw out draw a Z in the air or something, and I could do it. But that is gone in him, and it seems like it's this very subtle part of the brain that gets impacted that takes that away in Schneider, although he makes all these compensating behaviors. And so to me, this illustrates like the value of something like naturalized phenomenology. There's all this richness in the case study that Merleau-Ponty, to his credit, recognized by drawing on it so carefully. There's all this richness in the neuroscience, right? It's actually, visual agnosia is very rare. There's not a lot of examples of it. And I forget, there's just interesting stuff in that literature, like seeing without seeing, because the visual forms are there, but an ability to interact with them in a certain abstracted way isn't. And it's a very specific thing that's absent. And to make sense of it all, you just have to introduce a lot of concepts and pay attention to a lot of things. And, don't worry about all the critical stuff and all the debates. Let's just try and work out how it all works together. And so that's my approach in general. That's my approach to Merleau-Ponty. And it's in that same spirit that I'm interested now in moving into these difficult questions of chiasm and reversibility. I'm definitely going to be going back to this and rewatching the tapes for that. But anyway, that's the spirit in which I approach this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's really valuable, that kind of work that you're doing, to sort of say, look, so much of this debate has turned on, representationalism, anti-representationalism. Are there representations and how are they involved? And it's really important to slow down and say, what falls under the heading representation? If we sort of slice that up in more fine-grained ways, then we're going to end up with a much more nuanced sort of understanding of what is and isn't involved in sort of everyday perception and cognition. And it avoids the straw man version, while also, so we don't call it representation, or so we do. Let's try and understand what's going on, whatever it is that we call it. And then the important move that you're making is, and hook that up to what we know about the brain. It's good to see.
Of course, yeah. I mean,
thanks.
I would even say
think
that
the phenomenology is really playing a crucial role in this. I mean, Merleau-Ponty said things that you would not get if you only looked at the neuroscience and the psychology. Mm-hmm. This concept of a virtual space or of a natural physiognomy, and just all this, like he's just bombarding you with these metaphors that I found so difficult to bring it full circle that I just couldn't process at first. I'm now finding a way to find something useful and uptake it more.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. You both said you had a discussion about the kind of more from like a phenomenological perspective, or you'd call it phenomenological archaeology, and how the material environment has influences our consciousness. And I was really intrigued by that, especially, not that I've done a lot of any deep reading into that, but Dan Zahavi wrote this book on phenomenology, and towards the latter part of the book, he discusses, phenomenological sociology, but also phenomenological archaeology. And I thought that'd be a fun little bit to discuss. So I don't know which one of you want to go first, but I'd love to hear about just that bit, if we have a bit of time. We're going a bit over time here, regarding phenomenological archaeology, just to get to that point.
I'll defer to Robin on this. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So this is something that I've been sort of exploring and thinking about a lot recently, and it connects to some of the stuff I was saying earlier about flesh and nature. So it comes out of actually a tradition called cognitive archaeology, which is a sort of movement within the field of archaeology to try and understand the history of the mind, the history of the development of human cognition, by looking at archaeological resources. So things like, the hesitation marks in napping stones, and how you can sort of see the evolution of a practice in the archaeological record. And one of the things that sort of emerges from this way of thinking about the history of cognition something that resonates a lot with embodied and extended 4E models of mind, which is that the human subject can sort of like offload a lot of cognitive effort into the surrounding environment. And you see, of course, evidence of this in, clay tablets, which sort of serve as like reminders of, things to do. Linear B tells you, provides sort of tools to understand this written record. And there's interesting ways in which clay tablets would be color coded so that you didn't even have to read them to know what category of thing you were looking at. And so within cognitive archaeology, there's a lot of discussion about how the sort of ability to offload some of this effort onto the environment frees up resources for cognition to evolve in a particular way. So this is a pretty standard story. Where I'm sort of interested in is a lot of the cognitive archaeologists now are focused on the fact that suggests then that the material environment has an important role to play and an important constraining role, right? So clay dries at a particular rate, and the rate at which clay dries constrains how much you can write on it, and therefore how much cognitive effort you can offload onto a clay tablet is in part determined by the quality or character of the soil. So the idea is that the physical environment, the material environment, is an important component in the evolution of cognition. And so I'm interested in sort of what that means for how we think about cognition, how we think about mind, how we think about the role that the physical environment plays in thinking, and how we would have to think about materiality itself in order to be able to say that materiality has an active role to play in the construction of the mind as a kind of artifact of history and development. So that's sort of where the thought comes from. And I think Merleau-Ponty is sort of unique among phenomenologists in being able to participate in that discussion because of how much he's constantly urging us to think developmentally, historically, in terms of the materiality of meanings, in ways that Husserl is less inclined to do, to put it one way.
I'll just add that on that anthology that where I met Robin and that we initially worked on, and at that conference we had a section on phenomenological archaeology, which was very interesting, right? And I think it illustrates a lot of what I've been talking about as well, where you could take these different and often surprising lines of evidence, like the stuff you were talking about with clay tablets, and think about the phenomenology of ancient peoples using that. I mean, I would have thought there's just no hope at all of saying much about ancient phenomenology. And in fact, a dissertation was written after that came out here by somebody working on that. And there's a lot of interesting work in that area. And the idea that this Merleau-Ponty, one thing that comes out of this whole conversation today is, maybe this could be almost a final remark, is I came into Merleau-Ponty like this is it's all cryptic, it's all difficult philosophy, but this was even more cryptic for me. I was like, I just didn't know how to deal with it. And being able to see this concept of ambiguity, of the pendulum that swings back and forth or around where you see underneath it, seeing one continuous development in Merleau-Ponty, seeing how he draws on so many different kinds of sources, as you said, like art, history, even archaeology, psychology. He taught all these different classes and how he's kind of weaving through all these disciplines. This is a very rich source, I think, for many disciplines today, including archaeology. And so I think it's very exciting, and it's exciting for me to have Merleau-Ponty not back, because he was never really accessible, but accessible to me for the first time, to have a template for thinking about him. So yeah, thank you for that.
Cool.
Lovely. Yeah, I mean, I've got to say,
there's always more every time you go back.
Yeah, especially with a figure like Merleau-Ponty. And I got to say, for me, thank you for humoring me with that, Robert and Jeff, because I read Dan Zahavi write a bit about phenomenological archaeology, but then also I've been getting just a side interest of mine into anthropology, and there's this British anthropologist called Tim Ingold, and he writes a lot about he I think has a bit of Tim Ingold, he has a bit of a phenomenological perspective too.
He's
even
part
though
of
I think
this.
correct, yeah. Although I think he approaches it more from like a neo-materialist, vitalist kind of philosophy, which is like its own world. But I think, I don't know, my heart's still more with the phenomenology types, because I just find that way of thinking, it just sits better with me, I'd say. But no, as you were saying, Jeff, this has been just such a lovely, soul edifying conversation, if I could put it that way, despite the shoddy internet connection on my part. Look, I just want to thank you both, but before that, anything you think we've missed or worthwhile putting into this dialogue on phenomenology and the cognitive sciences?
No, this was great.
I learned a lot. I really appreciate the providing the occasion to explore these connections, and this was great.
Awesome.
Thank you, Rahul.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing it.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Unfortunately, as we were concluding, the internet connection was cut off on my end, and I couldn't say a proper au revoir to Jeff and Robin. And so once again, I am deeply grateful for both of their time, and I hope you, the listener, found the dialogue as valuable as I did.